Hello, and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host, Bo Heckman, and today we'll be continuing Rebecca with our guest reader, Amy Bjorklund. Amy, how are you today?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm well, thank you. How are you doing? Yes, exactly. I'm doing well.
What has happened the last time on Rebecca? What do we know so far?
Well, we know that we're doing the back and forth time thing. And so we are kind of living in her modern day, but remembering how things have happened. We learned these very, very vivid dreams that she and herself are having with her time at Mannerley. And we just met Mr. De Winter. So, and he sent a fantastically intriguing note to her with no name, no anything except not really an apology, but kind of an apology. So kind of caused her intrigue a little bit more. And we are staying with Mrs. Van Hopper in Monte Carlo right now. So it is.
That's where we're at. All right.
Yes, that's where we are. We're going to go see if she and Mr. De Winter get some. I was just saying, so this is the version we're reading. That I'm reading, at least. We're on page 21 today, chapter 4. And it was really hard not to read forward this weekend. I was like, I really want to see what happens, but now I'm going to wait and be with everyone. So I'm excited.
On the same page of discovery that everybody else is.
Yes.
Yes. We do have a comment in the comments section. This is our wonderful regular watcher, Stanley. And he's just saying hi, Bo. And Stanley, this is Amy. Amy, this is Stanley.
Hi,
Stanley. I turn things over to you and let you kick things off.
Off we go. Yes. All right. So we're going to delve right in. Again, we are on chapter 4. So if you're reading the updated version, not updated, but the newly released version to coincide with the Netflix film, here we go. Chapter 4. The morning after the bridge party, Mrs. Van Hopper woke up with a sore throat and a temperature of 102. I rang up her doctor, who came round at once and diagnosed the usual influenza. You are to stay in bed until I allow you to get up, he told her. I don't like the sound of that heart of yours, and it won't get better unless you keep perfectly quiet and still. I should prefer, he went on, turning to me, that Mrs. Van Hopper had a trained nurse. You can't possibly lift her. It would only be a fortnight or so. I thought this rather absurd and protested, but to my surprise, she agreed with him. I think she enjoyed the fuss it would create, the sympathy of people, the visits and messages from friends, and the arrival of flowers. Monte Carlo had begun to bore her, and this little illness would make a distraction. The nurse would give her injections and a light massage, and she would have a diet. I left her quite happy after the arrival of the nurse, propped up on pillows with a falling temperature, her best bed jacket around her shoulders, and beribboned boudoir cap upon her head. Rather ashamed of my light heart, I telephoned her friends, putting off the small party she arranged for the evening, and went down to the restaurant for lunch a good half hour before our usual time. I expected the room to be empty. Nobody lunched generally before 1 o'clock. It was empty except for the table next to ours. There was a contingency for which I was unprepared. I thought he had gone to Sopel. No doubt he was lunching early because he hoped to avoid us at 1 o'clock. I was already halfway across the room and could not go back. I had not seen him since we disappeared in the lift the day before, for wisely he had avoided dinner in the restaurant, possibly for the same reason that he lunched early now. It was a situation for which I was ill-trained. I wish I was older, different. I went to our table, looking straight before me, and immediately paid the penalty of Gaugier by knocking over the vase of stiff anemas as I unfolded my napkin. The water soaked the cloth and ran down onto my lap. The waiter was on the other end of the room, nor had he seen. In a second, though, my neighbor was by my side, dry napkin in hand. You can't sit at a wet tablecloth, he said brusquely. It will put you off your food. Get out of the way. He began to mop the cloth while the waiter, seeing the disturbance, came swiftly to the rescue. Oh, I don't mind, I said. It doesn't matter a bit. I'm all alone. He said nothing, and then the waiter arrived and whipped away the vase and the sprawling flowers. Leave that and lay another place at my table. Mademoiselle will have luncheon with me. I looked up in confusion. Oh, no, I said. I couldn't possibly. Why not? He said. I tried to think of an excuse. I knew he would not want to lunch with me. It was his form of courtesy. I should ruin his meal. I was determined to be bold and speak the truth. Please, I begged, don't be polite. It is very kind of you, but I shall be quite all right if the waiter just wipes the cloth. But I'm not being polite, he insisted. I would like you to have luncheon with me. Even if you had knocked over that vase so clumsily, I should have asked you. I suppose my face told him the doubt, for he smiled. You don't believe me, he said. Never mind. Come, sit down. We needn't talk to each other unless we feel like it. We sat down, and he gave me the menu, leaving me to choose, and went on with his hors d'oeuvre as though nothing had happened. His quality of detachment was peculiar to himself, and I knew that we might continue this, without speaking, throughout the meal, and it would not matter. There would be no sense of strain. He would not ask me my questions on history. What happened to your friend? He said. I told him about the influenza. I'm so sorry, he said. And then, after pausing a moment, you got my note, I suppose. I felt very much ashamed of myself. My manners were atrocious. The only excuse I can make is that I've become boorish through living alone. That's why it's so kind of you to lunch with me today. Well, you weren't rude, I said. At least, not the sort of rudeness she would understand. That curiosity of hers, she does not mean to be offensive, but she does it to everyone. That is, everyone of importance. I ought to be flattered then, he said. Why should she consider me of any importance? I hesitated a moment before replying. I think because of Manderley, I said. He did not answer, and I was aware again of that feeling of discomfort, as though I had trespassed on forbidden ground. I wondered why it was that this home of his, known to so many people by hearsay, even to me, should so inevitably silence him, making, as it were, a barrier between him and others. We ate for a while without talking, and I thought of a picture postcard I had bought once at a village shop when on holiday as a child in the West Country. It was the painting of a house, crudely done, of course, and highly colored, but even those faults could not destroy the symmetry of the building, the wide stone steps before the terrace, the green lawn stretched to the sea. I paid 2 pence for that painting, half my weekly pocket money, and then asked the wrinkled shopwoman what it was meant to be. She looked astonished at my ignorance. That's Manderley, she said, and I remember coming out of the shop feeling rebuffed, yet hardly wiser than before. Perhaps it was the memory of this postcard, lost long ago in some forgotten book, that made me sympathize with his defensive attitude. He resented Mrs. Hopper and her like with their intruding questions. Maybe there was something involuted about Manderley that made it a place apart. It would not bear discussion. I could imagine her tramping through the rooms, perhaps paying 6 pence for admission, ripping the quietude with her sharp staccato laugh. Our minds must have run in the same channel, for he began to talk about her. Your friend, he began. She is very much older than you. Is she a relation? Have you known her long? I knew he was still puzzled by us. She's not really a friend, I told him. She's an employer. She's training me to be a thing called a companion, and she pays me £90 a year. I did not know one could buy companionship, he said. Sounds like a primitive idea, rather like the Eastern slave market. I looked up the word companion once in the dictionary, I admitted, and it said, a companion is a friend of the bosom. You haven't much in common with her, he said. He laughed, looking quite indifferent, younger somehow and less detached. What do you do it for? He asked me. £90 is a lot of money to me, I said. Haven't you any family? No, they're dead. You have a very lovely and unusual name. My father was a lovely and unusual person. Tell me about him, he said. I looked at him over my glass of citronade. I looked at him over my glass of citronade. It was not easy to explain my father, and usually I never talked about him. He was my secret property, preserved for me alone, much as Manderley was preserved for my neighbor. I had no wish to introduce him casually over a table in Monte Carlo restaurant. There was a strange air of unreality about the luncheon, and looking back upon it now, it is invested for me with a curious glamour. There was I, so much the schoolgirl still, who only the day before had sat with Mrs. Van Hopper, prim, silent, and subdued, and 24 hours afterward my family history was mine no longer. I shared it with a man I did not know. For some reason I felt impelled to speak, because his eyes followed me in sympathy like the gentleman unknown. My shyness fell away from me, loosening as it did to my reluctant tongue, and out they all came. the little secrets of childhood, the pleasures and the pains. It seemed to me as though he understood, from my poor description, something of the vibrant personality that had been my father's, and something too of the love my mother had had for him, making it a vital, living force with a spark of divinity about it, so much that when he died that desperate winter, struck down by pneumonia, she lingered behind him for 5 short weeks and stayed no more. I remembered pausing, a little breathless, a little dazed. The restaurant was filled now with people who chatted and laughed to an orchestral background and a clatter of plates. And glancing at the clock above the door, I saw that it was 2 o'clock. We had been sitting there an hour and a half, and the conversation had been mine alone. I tumbled down into reality, hot-handed and self-conscious, with my face aflame, and began to stammer my apologies. He would not listen to me. I told you at the beginning of lunch you had a lovely and unusual name, he said. I shall go further, if you will forgive me, and say that it becomes you as well as it became your father. I enjoyed this hour with you more than I enjoyed anything for a very long time. You've taken me out of myself, out of the despondency and introspection, both of which have been my devils for a year. I looked at him and believed he spoke the truth. He seemed less better than he had been before, more modern, more human. He was not hemmed in by shadows. You know, he said, we've got a bond in common, you and I. We are both alone in the world. Oh, I've got a sister, though we don't see very much of each other, and an ancient grandmother whom I pay duty visits to 3 times a year, but neither of them makes for companionship. I shall have to congratulate Mrs. Van Hopper. You're cheap at £90 a year. You forget, I said. You have a home, and I have none. The moment I spoke, I regretted my words, for the secret, inscrutable look came in his eyes again, and for once I suffered the intolerable discomfort that floods one after a lack of tact. He bent his head to light a cigarette and did not reply immediately. An empty house can be as lonely as a full hotel, he said at length. The trouble is that it is less impersonal. He hesitated, and for a moment I thought he was going to talk of Manderley at last, but something held him back. Some phobia that struggled to the surface of his mind and won supremacy, for he blew out his match and his flash of confidence at the same time. So the friend of the bosom has a holiday, he said on a level plane again, an easy camaraderie between us. What does she propose to do with it? I thought of the cobbled square in Monaco and the house with the narrow window. I could be off there by 3 o'clock with my sketchbook and pencil, and I told him as much, a little shyly, perhaps, like an untalented person with a pet hobby. I'll drive you there in the car, he said, and would not listen to protest. I remembered Mrs. Van Hopper's warning of the night before about putting myself forward, and was embraced that he might think my walk to Monaco was a subterfuge to win a lift. It was so blatantly the type of thing that she would do herself, and I did not want him to bracket us together. I had already risen in importance for my lunch with him, for as we got up from the table, the little maitre d'hotel rushed toward us to pull away my chair. He bowed and smiled, a total change from his usual attitude of indifference, picked up my handkerchief that had fallen on the floor, and hoped Mademoiselle had enjoyed her lunch. Even the page boy by the swing doors glanced at me with respect. My companion accepted it as natural, of course. He knew nothing of the ill-carved ham of yesterday. I found the change depressing, and made me despise myself. I remembered my father and his scorn of superficial snobbery. What are you thinking about? We were walking along the corridor to the lounge, and looking up, I saw his eyes fixed on me in curiosity. Has something annoyed you? He said. The intentions of the maitre d'hotel had opened up a train of thought, and as we drank our coffee, I told him about Blaise, the dressmaker. She had been so pleased when Mrs. Van Hopper had bought 3 frocks, and I, taking her to the left afterward, had pictured her working upon them in her small salon behind the stuffy little shop, with the consumptive sun wasting upon her sofa. I could see her, with tired eyes, threading needles, and the floor covered with snippets of material. Well, he said, smiling, wasn't your picture true? I don't know, I said. I never found out. And I told him how I had rung the bell for the lift, and as I had done so, she had fumbled in her bag and given me a note for 100 francs. Here, she had whispered, her tone intimate and unpleasant. I want you to accept this small commission in return for bringing your patron to my shop. When I had refused, scarlet with embarrassment, she had shrugged her shoulders disagreeably. Just as you like, she had said, but I assure you it's quite usual. Perhaps you would rather have a frock. Come along to the shop sometime, without madam, and I will fix you up without charging you a sou. Somehow, I don't know why, I had been aware of that sick, unhealthy feeling I had experienced as a child when turning the pages of a forbidden book. The vision of the consumptive son faded, and in its stead arose the picture of myself had I been different, pocketing that greasy note in an understanding smile, and perhaps slipping around to Blaze's shop on this, my free afternoon, and coming away with a frock I had not paid for. I expected him to laugh. It was a stupid story. I don't know why I told him, but he looked at me thoughtfully as he stirred his coffee. I think you have made a big mistake, he said, after a moment. In refusing that 100 francs? I asked, revolted. No, good heavens, what do you take me for? I think you've made a mistake in coming here, joining forces with Mrs. Van Hopper. You are not made for that sort of job. You are too young, for one thing, and too soft. Blaze and her commission, that's nothing. The first of many similar incidents from other Blazes. You will either have to give in and become a sort of Blaze yourself, or stay as you and be broken. Who suggested you take on this thing in the first place? Well, it seemed natural for him to question me, nor did I mind. It was as though we had known one another for a long time and had met again after a lapse in years. Have you ever thought about the future? He asked me, and what this sort of thing will lead to? Supposing Mrs. Van Hopper gets tired of her friend of the bosom, what then? I smiled and told him that I did not mind very much. There would be other Mrs. Van Hoppers, and I was young and confident and strong. But even as he spoke, I remembered those advertisements seen often in good-class magazines where a friendly society demands succor for young women in reduced circumstances. I thought of the type of boarding house that answers the advertisement and gives temporary shelter. And then I saw myself, useless sketchbook in hand, without qualifications of any kind, stammering replies to stern employment agents. Perhaps I should have accepted Blaze's 10%. How old are you? He said. And when I told him, he laughed and got up from his chair. I know that age. It's a particularly obstinate one, and 1,000 bogies won't make you fear the future. Pity we can't change over. Go upstairs and put your hat on, and I'll have the car brought around. As he watched me into the lift, I thought of yesterday, Mrs. Van Hopper's chattering tongue and his cold courtesy. I had ill-judged him. He was neither hard nor sardonic. He was already my friend of many years, the brother I had never possessed. Mine was a happy mood that afternoon, and I remember it well. I can see the rippled sky, fluffy with cloud, and the white-whipped sea. I can feel again the wind in my face and hear my laugh, his that echoed it. It was not the Monte Carlo I had known, or perhaps the truth was that it pleased me better. There was a glamour about it that had not been there before. I must have seen it before with dull eyes. And the harbor was a dancing thing with fluttering paper boats, and the sailors on the quay were jovial, smiling fellows, merry in the wind. We passed the yacht, beloved of Mrs. Van Hopper because of its local owner, and snapped our finger at the glistening brass, and looked at one another and laughed again. I can remember as though I wore it still my comfortable, ill-fitting flannel suit, and how the skirt was lighter than the coat through harder wear, my shabby hat too broad around the brim, and my low-heeled shoes fastened with a single strap, a pair of gauntlet gloves clutched in a grubby hand. I had never looked more youthful. I had never felt so old. Mrs. Van Hopper and her influenza did not exist for me. The bridge and the cocktail parties were forgotten, and with them my own humble status. I was a person of importance. I was grown up at last. That girl who, tortured by shyness, would stand outside the sitting room door twisting a handkerchief in her hands, while from within came that babble of confusion clatter so unnerving to the intruder. She had gone with the wind that afternoon. She was a poor creature, and I thought of her with scorn, as if I considered her at all. The wind was too high for sketching. It tore in cheerful gusts around the corner of my cobbled square, and back to the car we went and drove, I know not where. The long road climbed the hills, and the car climbed with it, and we circled in the heights like a bird in the air. How different this car to Mrs. Van Hopper's hiring for the season, a square old-fashioned Daimler that took us to Monton on placid afternoons, when I, sitting on the little seat with my back to the driver, must crane my neck to see the view. This car had the wings of Mercury, I thought, for higher yet we climbed, and dangerously fast, and the danger pleased me because it was new to me, because I was young. I remember laughing out loud, and the laugh being carried by the wind away from me. And looking at him, I realized he laughed no longer. who was once more silent and detached, the man of yesterday wrapped in his secret self. I realized, too, that the car could climb no more. We had reached the summit. Below us stretched the way that we had come, precipitous and hollow. He stopped the car, and I could see that the edge of the road bordered a vertical slope that crumbled into vacancy, a fall of perhaps 2,000 feet. We got out of the car and looked beneath us. Well, this sobered me at last. I knew that but half the car's length had lain between us and the fall. The sea, like a crinkled chart, spread into the horizon and lapped the sharp outline of the coast, while the houses were white shells on a rounded grotto, pricked here and there by a great orange sun. We knew another sunlight on our hill, and the silence made it harder, more austere. A change had come upon our afternoon. It was not the thing of gossamer it had been. The wind dropped, and it suddenly grew cold. When I spoke, my voice was far too casual, the silly, nervous voice of someone ill at ease. "Do you know this place?" I said. "Have you been here before?" He looked down at me without recognition, and I realized with a little stab of anxiety that he must have forgotten all about me, perhaps for some considerable time, and that he himself was so lost in the labyrinth of his own unquiet thoughts that I did not exist. He had the face of one who walks in his sleep, and for a wild moment the idea came to me that perhaps he was not normal, not altogether sane. There were people who had trances, I had surely heard of them, and they followed strange laws of which we could know nothing. They obeyed to the tangled orders of their own subconscious minds. Perhaps he was one of them, and here we were within 6 feet of death. "It's getting late. Shall we go home?" I said, and my careless tone, my little ineffectual smile, would scarcely have deceived a child. I had misjudged him, of course. There was nothing wrong, after all, for as soon as I spoke the second time, he became clear of his dream and began to apologize. I had gone white, I suppose, and he had noticed it. "That was an unforgivable thing for me to do," he said, and taking my arm, he pushed me back towards the car, and we climbed in again, and he slammed the door. "Don't be frightened. The turn is far easier than it looks." And while I, sick and giddy, clung to the seat with both hands, he maneuvered the car gently, very gently, until it faced the sloping road once more. "Then you have been there before," I said to him, my sense of strain departing, and as the car crept down the twisting, narrow road. "Yes," he said, and then, after pausing a moment, "but not for many years. I wanted to see if it had changed." "And has it?" I asked him. "No," he said. "No, it has not changed." I wonder what had driven him to this retreat into the past, with me as an unconscious witness of his mood. What gulf of years stretched between him and that other time? What deed of thought and action? What difference in temperament? I did not want to know. I wish I had not come. Down the twisting road we went without a check, without a word. A great ridge of clouds stretched above the setting sun, and the air was cold and clean. Suddenly, he began to talk about Manderley. He said nothing of his life there, no word about himself, but he told me how the sun set there on a spring afternoon, leaving a glow upon the headland. The sea would look like slate, cold still from the long winter, and from the terrace you could hear the ripple of the coming tide washing the little bay. The daffodils were in bloom, stirring in the evening breeze, golden heads cupped upon lean stalks, and however many you might pick, there would be no thinning of the ranks. They were massed like an army, shoulder to shoulder. On a bank below the lawns, crocuses were planted, golden, pink, and mauve, but by this time they would have passed their best, dropping and fading like the pallid snowdrops. The primrose was more vulgar, a homely, pleasant creature who appeared in every cranny like a weed. Too early yet for bluebells, their heads were still hidden beneath last year's leaves, but when they came, dwarfing the more humble violet, they choked the very bracken in the woods, and with their color made a challenge to the sky. He never would have left them in the house, he said. Thrust into vases, they became dank and listless. To see them at their best, you must walk in the woods in the morning about 12 o'clock when the sun was overhead. They had a smoky, rather bitter smell, as though wild sap ran in their stalks, pungent and juicy. People who plucked bluebells from the wood were vandals. He had forbidden it at Manderley. Sometimes, driving in the country, he had seen bicyclists with huge bunches strapped before them in the handles, the blooms already fading from the dying heads, the ravaged stalks strangling naked and unclean. Now the primrose did not mind it quite so much. Although a creature of the wild, it had a leaning towards civilization, and preened and smiled in a jam jar in some cottage window without resentment, giving quite a week if given water. No wildflowers came in the house at Manderley. He had special cultivated flowers, grown for the house alone, in the walled garden. A rose was one of the few flowers, he said, that looked better picked than growing. A bowl of roses in a drawing room had a depth of color and scent they had not possessed in the open. There was something rather blowsy about roses in full bloom, something shallow and raucous, like a woman with untidy hair. In the house, they became mysterious and subtle. He had roses in the house at Manderley for 8 months in the year. Did I like syringa? He asked. There was a tree on the edge of the lawn he could smell from his bedroom window. His sister, who was a hard, rather practical person, used to complain that there were too many scents at Manderley. They made her drunk. Or perhaps she was right. He did not care. It was the only form of intoxication that appealed to him. His earliest recollection was of great branches of lilac, standing in white jars, and they filled the house with a wistful, poignant smell. The little pathway down the valley to the bay had clumps of azalea and the rhododendron planted to the left of it, and if you wandered down it on a May evening after dinner, it was just as though the shrubs had sweated in the air. You could stoop down and pick up a fallen petal, crush it between your fingers, and you had there, in the hollow of your hand, the essence of 1,000 scents, unbearable and sweet, all from a curled and crumpled petal. And you came out of the valley, heady and rather dazed, to the hard white shingle of the beach and the still water. A curious, perhaps too sudden contrast. As he spoke, the car became one of many once again. Dusk had fallen without my noticing, and we were in the midst of the light and sound of the streets of Monte Carlo. The clatter jagged on my nerves, and the lights were far too brilliant, far too yellow. It was my swift, unwelcome anticlimax. Soon we would come to the hotel, and I felt for my gloves in the pocket of the car. I found them, and my fingers closed upon a book as well, whose slim covers told of poetry. I peered to read the title as the car slowed down before the door of the hotel. "You can take it and read it if you like," he said, his voice casual and indifferent now that the drive was over, and we were back again, and Manderley was many hundreds of miles distant. I was glad and held it tightly with my gloves. I felt I wanted some possession of him now that the day was finished. "Hop out," he said. "I must go and put the car away. I shan't see you in the restaurant this evening, as I am dining out. But thank you for today." I went up the hostel steps alone, with all the despondency of a child whose treat is over. My afternoon had spoilt me for the hours that still remained, and I thought how long it would seem until my bedtime, how empty, too, my supper, all alone. Somehow I could not face the bright inquiries of the nurse upstairs, or the possibilities of Mrs. Van Hopper's husky interrogation, so I sat down in the corner of the lounge behind a pillar and ordered tea. The waiter appeared bored. Seeing me alone, there was no need for him to press, and anyway, it was just dragging time of day, a few minutes after half 5, when the normal tea is finished and the hour of drinks remote. Rather forlorn, more than a little dissatisfied, I leant back in my chair and took up the book of poems. The volume was well worn, well thumbed, falling open automatically at what must be a much frequented page. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinth ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him and under running laughter. Up visited slopes I sped and shot, precipitated down titanic glooms of chasmed fears from those strong feet that followed after. I felt rather like someone peering through the keyhole of a locked door, and a little furtively I laid the book aside. What hound of heaven had driven him in the high hills this afternoon? I thought of his car, with half a length between it and that drop of 2,000 feet, and the blank expression on his face. What footsteps echoed in his mind, what whispers, what memories, and why, of all poems, must he keep this one with the pocket of his car? I wished he were less remote, and I anything but the creature that I was in my shabby coat and skirt and my broad-brimmed schoolgirl hat. The sulky waiter brought my tea, and while I ate bread and butter dull as sawdust, I thought of the pathway through the valley he had described to me this afternoon, the smell of the azaleas and the white shingle of the bay. If he loved it all so much, why did he seek the superficial froth of Monte Carlo? He had told Mrs. Van Hopper he had made no plans. He came away in rather a hurry. And I pictured him running down that pathway in the valley with his own hound of heaven at his heels. I picked up the book again, and this time it opened at the title page, and I read the dedication. Max, from Rebecca, May 17th. Written in a curious, slanted hand. A little blob of ink marred the white page opposite, as though the writer, in impatience, had shaken her pen to make the ink flow freely. And then, as it bubbled through the nib, it came a little thick, so the name Rebecca stood out black and strong, the tall and sloping R dwarfing the other letters. I shut the book with a snap and put away my gloves and stretched to a nearby chair. I took an old copy of the illustration and turned all the pages. There were some fine photographs of the Chateau of the Loire, and an article as well. I read it carefully, referring to the photographs, but when I finished, I knew I had not understood a word. It was not Blois with its thin turrets and spires that stared up at me from the printed page. It was the face of Mrs. Van Hopper in the restaurant the day before, her small pig's eyes darting to the neighboring table, her fork heaped high with ravioli pausing in midair. An appalling tragedy, she was saying. The papers were full of it, of course. They say he never talks about it, never mentions her name. She was drowned, you know, in a bay near Manderley. Chapter 5. I'm glad it cannot happen twice, the fever of first love, for it is a fever, and a burden, too, whatever the poets may say. They are not brave, the days when we are 21. They are full of little cowardices, little fears without foundation, and one is so easily bruised, so swiftly wounded, one falls to the first barbed word. Today, wrapped in the complacent armor of approaching middle age, the infinitesimal pricks of day by day brush one but lightly and are soon forgotten. But then, oh, how a careless word would linger, becoming a fiery stigma, and how a look, a glance over a shoulder, branded themselves as things eternal. A denial heralded the thrice crowing of a cock, and with insincerity was like the kiss of Judas. The adult mind can lie with untroubled conscience and a gay composure, but in those days even a small deception cowered the tongue, lashing one against the stake itself. What have you been doing this morning? I can hear her now, propped against her pillows, with all the small irritability of the patient who is not really ill, who has lain in bed too long, and I, reaching to the bedside opposite for the pack of cards, would feel the guilty flush form patches on my neck. I've been playing tennis with a professional, I told her, the false words bringing me to panic even as I spoke, for what if the professional himself should come up to the suite then that very afternoon and bursting in upon her complain that I had missed my lesson now for many days. The trouble is with me laying up like this, you haven't got enough to do, she said, smashing her cigarette in a jar of cleansing cream, and taking the cards in her hand, she mixed them in the deft, irritating shuffle of the enervant player, shaking them in threes, snapping the backs. I don't know what you find to do with yourself all day, she went on. You never have any sketches to show me, and when I do ask you to do some shopping for me, you forget to buy my taxol. And all I can say is that I hope your tennis will improve. It will be useful to you later on. A poor player is a great bore. Do you still serve underhand? She flipped the queen of spades into the pool, and the dark face stared at me like Jezebel. Yes, I said, stung by her question, thinking how just and appropriate her word. Described me well. I was underhand. I had not played tennis with a professional at all. I had not once played since she had lain in bed, and that was a little over a fortnight now. I wonder why it was I clung to this reserve, and why it was I did not tell her that every morning I drove with De Winter in his car and lunched with him too, and in his table at the restaurant. You must come to the net more. You will never play a good game until you do, she continued, and I agreed, flinching at my own hypocrisy, covering her queen with a weak-chinned knave of hearts. I have forgotten much of Monte Carlo, of those morning drives, of where we went, even our conversation, but I have not forgotten how my fingers trembled, cramming on my hat, and how I ran along the corridor and down the stairs, too impatient to wait for the slow whining of the lift, and so outside brushing the swings door open before the commissionaire could help me. He would be there in the driver's seat, reading a paper while he waited. And when he saw me, he would smile and toss it behind him in the back seat and open the door saying, "Well, how is the friend of the bosom this morning? And where does she want to go?" If he had driven around in circles, it would not have mattered to me, for I was in that first flushed stage when to climb into the seat beside him and lean forward to the windscreen, hugging my knees, was almost too much to bear. I was like a little scrubby schoolboy with a passion for sixth form, prefect, and he kinder and more inaccessible. "There's a cold wind this morning. You'd better put on my coat." I remember that, for I was young enough to win happiness in the wearing of his clothes, playing the schoolboy again who carries his hero's sweater and ties it about his throat, choking with pride. And this borrowing of his coat, wearing it around my shoulders for even a few minutes at a time, was a triumph in itself and made a glow about my morning. Not for me the languor and the subtlety I'd read about in books, the challenge and the chase, the sword play, the swift glance, the stimulating smile. The art of provocation was unknown to me, and I would sit with his map upon my lap, the wind blowing my dull, lanky hair, happy in his silence, yet eager for his words. Whether he talked or not made little difference to my mood. My only enemy was the clock on the dashboard, whose hands would move relentlessly to 1 o'clock. We drove east, we drove west, amidst the myriad villages that cling like limpets on the Mediterranean shore, and today I remember none of them. All I remember is the feel of the leather seats, the texture of the map upon my knee, its frayed edges, its worn seams, and how one day, looking at the clock, I thought to myself, this moment now, at 11:20, this must never be lost. And I shut my eyes to make the experience more lasting. When I opened my eyes, we were by a bend in the road, and a peasant girl in a black shawl waved to us. I can see her now, her dusty skirt, her gleaming, friendly smile, and in a second we had passed the bend and could see her no more. Already she belonged to the past. She was only a memory. I wanted to go back again, to recapture the moment that had gone, and then it came to me that if we did it, it would not be the same. Even the sun would have changed in the sky, casting another shadow, and the peasant girl would trudge past us along the road in a different way, not waving this time, and perhaps not even seeing us. There was something chilly in the thought, something a little melancholy, and looking at the clock, I saw that 5 more minutes had gone by. Soon we would have reached our time limit and must return to the hotel. If only there could be an invention, I said impulsively, that bottled up a memory, like a scent, and it never faded and it never got stale. And then, when one wanted it, the bottle could be uncorked and it would be like living the moment all over again. I looked up at him to see what he would say. He did not turn to me. He went on watching the road ahead. "What particular moments in your young life do you wish uncorked?" he said. I could not tell from his voice whether he was teasing me or not. "I'm not sure," I began, and then blundered on rather foolishly, not thinking of my words. "I'd like to keep this moment and never forget it." "Is that meant to be a compliment to the day or to my driving?" he said, and as he laughed, like a mocking brother, I became silent, overwhelmed suddenly that by the great gulf between us and how his very kindness to me widened it. I knew that I would never tell Mrs. Van Hopper about these morning expeditions, for her smile would hurt me as his laugh had done. She would not be angry, nor would she be shocked. She would raise her eyebrows very faintly, and though she did not altogether believe my story, and then with a tolerant shrug of the shoulders, she would say, "My dear child, it's extremely sweet and kind of him to take you driving. The only thing is, are you sure it does not bore him dreadfully?" And then she would send me to buy Taxol, patting me on the shoulder. Degradingly and being young, I thought, and fell to tearing at my nails. "I wish," I said savagely, still mindful of his laugh and throwing discretion to the wind, "I wish I was a woman of about 36, dressed in black satin with a string of pearls." "Well, you would not be in this car with me if you were," he said, "and stop biting your nails. They are ugly enough already." "You'll think me impertinent and rude, I dare say," I went on, "but I would like to know why you asked me to come out in the car day after day. You're being kind, that's obvious, but why do you choose me for your charity?" I sat up stiff and straight in my seat with all the proper, poor pomposity of youth. "I ask you," he said gravely, because you are not dressed in black satin with a string of pearls, nor are you 36. His face was without expression, and I could not tell whether he laughed inwardly or not. Well, it's all very well, I said. You know everything there is to know about me. There's not much, I admit, because I have not been alive for very long, and nothing much has happened to me, except people dying. But you, I know nothing more about you than I did the first day we met. And what did you know then? He asked. Why, that you lived at Manderley, and that you had lost your wife. There, I had said it at last, the word that had hovered in my tongue for days. Your wife. It came out with ease, without reluctance, as though the mere mention of her must be the most casual thing in all the world. Your wife. The word lingered in the air once I uttered it, dancing before me, and because he received it silently, making no comment, the word magnified itself into something heinous and appalling, a forbidden word, unnatural to the tongue, and I could not call it back. It would never be unsaid. Once again, I saw the inscription on the flyleaf of that book of poems and the curious slanting R. I felt sick at heart and cold. He would never forgive me, and this would be the end of our friendship. I remember staring straight in front of me at the windscreen, seeing nothing of the flying road, my ears still tingling with that spoken word. The silence became minutes, and the minutes became miles, and everything is over now, I thought. I shall never drive with him again. Tomorrow he will go away, and Mrs. Van Hopper will be up again. And she and I will walk along the terrace as we did before. The porter will bring his trunks. I shall catch a glimpse of them in the luggage lift with new plastered labels. The bustle, and finally the departure. The sound of the car changing gear as it turned the corner, and then even that sound merging into the common traffic and being lost and so absorbed forever. I was so deep in my picture, I even saw the porter pocketing his tip and going back through the swinging door of the hotel, saying something over his shoulder to the commissionaire that I did not notice the slowing down of the car, and it was only when we stopped, drawing up by the side of the road, that I brought myself back to the present again. He sat motionless, without his hat and white scarf around his neck, looking more than ever like some medieval thing who lived without a frame. He did not belong to the bright landscape. He should be standing on the steps of a gaunt cathedral, his cloak flung back while a beggar at his feet scrambled for gold coins. The friend had gone, with his kindliness and his easy camaraderie, and the brother, too, who had mocked me for nibbling at my nails. This man was a stranger, and I wondered why I was sitting beside him in the car. Then he turned to me and spoke. A little while ago you talked about an invention, he said. Some scheme for capturing a memory. You would like, you told me, at a chosen moment to live the past again. I'm afraid I think rather differently from you. All memories are bitter, and I prefer to ignore them. Something happened a year ago that altered my whole life, and I want to forget every phrase of my existence up to that time. Those days are finished. They are blotted out. I must begin living all over again. The first day we met, your Mrs. Van Hopper asked me why I came to Monte Carlo. It put a stopper on those memories you would like to resurrect. It does not always work, of course. Sometimes the scent is too strong for the bottle and too strong for me. And then the devil in one, like a furtive peeping Tom, tries to draw the cork. I did that on the first drive we took together, when we climbed the hills and looked down over the precipice. I was there some years ago with my wife. You asked me if it was still the same, if it had changed at all. It was just the same, but I was thankful to realize, oddly impersonal. There was no suggestion of the other time. She and I had left no record. It may have been because you were with me. You blotted out the past for me, far more effectively than all the bright lights of Monte Carlo. But for you, I should have left long ago, gone to Italy, Greece, and further still, perhaps. You have spared me all those wanderings. Damn your puritanical little tight-lipped speech to me. Damn your idea of my kindness and my charity. I asked you to come with me because I want you and your company, and if you don't believe me, you can leave the car now and find your own way home. Go on, open the door and get out. I sat still, my hand in my lap, not knowing whether he meant it or not. Well, he asked, what are you going to do about it? Had I been a year or two younger, I think I would have cried. Children's tears are very near the surface and come at first crisis. As it was, I felt the prick behind my eyes, felt the ready color flood my face, and catching a sudden glimpse of myself in the glass above the windscreen, saw in full sorry spectacle that I had made, with troubled eyes and scarlet cheeks, lank hair flapping under broad felt hat. "I want to go home," I said, my voice perilously near to trembling. And without a word, he started up the engine, let it in clutch, and turned the car around the way we had come. Swiftly we covered the ground, far too swiftly, I thought, far too easily, and the callous countryside watched us with indifference. We came to the bend in the road that I had wished to imprison as a memory, and the peasant girl was gone, and the color was flat, and it was no more after all than a bend in any road passed by 100 motorists. The glamour of it had gone with my happy mood, and at the thought of it my frozen face quivered into feeling, my adult pride was lost, and those despicable tears, rejoicing in their conquest, welled into my eyes and strayed upon my cheeks. I could not check them, for they came unbidden, and I had reached in my pocket for a handkerchief he would have seen. I must let them fall untouched and suffer the bitter salt upon my lips, plumbing the depths of humiliation. Whether he had turned his head to look at me, I do not know, for I watched the road ahead with blurred and steady stare. But suddenly he put out his hand, took hold of mine, and kissed it, still saying nothing. And then he threw his handkerchief upon my lap, which I was too ashamed to touch. I thought of all those heroines of fiction who looked pretty when they cried, and what a contrast I must make with blotched and swollen face and red rims to my eyes. Oh, it was a dismal finish to my morning, and the day that stretched ahead of me was long. I had to lunch with Mrs. Van Hopper in her room because the nurse was going out, and afterwards she would make me play bezique with all the tireless energy of a convalescent. I knew I should stifle in that room. There was something sordid about the tumbling sheets, the sprawling blankets, and the thumped pillows, and that bedside table dusty with powder, split scent, and melting liquid rouge. Her bed would be littered with separate sheets of the daily papers folded anyhow, while French novels with curling edges and the covers torn kept company with American magazines. The smashed stubs of cigarettes lay everywhere, in cleansing cream, in a dish of grapes, and on the floor beneath the bed. Visitors were lavish with their flowers, and the vases stood cheek by jowl in any fashion, hothouse exotics crammed beside mimosa, while a great beribboned basket crowned them all with tier upon tier of crystallized fruit. Later, her friends would come in for a drink, which I must mix for them, hating my task, shy and ill at ease in my corner, hemmed in by their parrot chatter. And I would be a whipping boy again, blushing for her when, excited by her little crowd, she must sit up in bed and talk too loudly, laugh too long, reach to the portable gramophone and start a record, shrugging her large shoulders to the tune. I preferred her irritable and snappy, her hair done up in pins, scolding me for forgetting her taxol. All this awaited me in the suite, while he, once he had left me at the hotel, would go away somewhere alone, towards the sea perhaps, feel the wind on his cheek, follow the sun. And it might happen that he would lose himself in those memories that I knew nothing of, that I could not share. He would wander down the years that were gone. The gulf that lay between us was wider now than it had ever been, and he stood away from me, with his back turned, on the further shore. I felt young and small and very much alone, and now, in spite of my pride, I found his handkerchief and blew my nose, throwing my drab appearance to the winds. It would never matter. To hell with this, he said suddenly, and as though angry, as though bored, and he pulled me beside him and put his arm around my shoulder, still looking straight ahead of him, his right hand on the wheel. He drove, I remember, even faster than before. "I suppose you are young enough to be my daughter, and I don't know how to deal with you," he said. The road narrowed then to a corner, and he had to swerve to avoid a dog. I thought he would release me, but he went on pressing me beside him, and when the corner was passed and the road came straight again, he did not let me go. "You can forget all I said to you this morning," he said. "That's all finished and done with. Let's ever think of it again. My family always calls me Maxim. I'd like you to do the same. You've been formal with me for long enough." He felt for the brim of my hat and took hold of it, throwing it over his shoulder to the back seat, and then bent down and kissed the top of my head. "Promise me you will never wear black satin," he said. I smiled then, and he laughed back at me, and the morning was gay again. The morning was a shining thing. Mrs. Van Hopper in the afternoon did not matter a flip of the finger. It would pass so quickly, and there would be tonight and another day tomorrow. I was cocksure, jubilant at that moment. I almost had the courage to claim equality. I saw myself strolling into Mrs. Van Hopper's bedroom rather late from my beziquet, and then questioned by her yawning, carelessly saying, "I forgot the time. I've been lunching with Maxim." I was still child enough to consider a Christian name like a plume in the hat, though from it the very first he had called me by mine. The morning, for all its shadowed moments, had promoted me to a new level of friendship. I did not lag so far behind as I had thought. He had kissed me to a natural business, comforting and quiet, not romantic, not dramatic as in books, not embarrassing. It seemed to bring about an ease in our friendship. It made everything more simple. The gulf between us had been abridged after all. I was to call him Maxim. And that afternoon, playing bezique with Mrs. Van Hopper was not so tedious as it might have been, though my courage failed me and I said nothing of my morning. For when, gathering her cards together at the end and reaching for the box, she had said casually, "Tell me, is Max de Winter still in the hotel?" I hesitated a moment, like a diver on the brink, then lost my nerve and my tutored self-possession, saying, "Yes, I believe so. He comes to the restaurant for his meals." Someone has told her, I thought. Someone has seen us together. The tennis professional has complained. The manager has sent a note, and I waited for her attack. But she went on putting the cards back into the box, yawning a little while I straightened the tumbled bed. I gave her the bowl of powder, the rouge compact, and the lipstick, and she put away the cards and took up the hand glass from the table by her side. "Attractive creature," she said, "but queer-tempered, I should think. Difficult to know. I thought he might have made some gesture of asking one to Manderley that day in the lounge, but he was very close." I said nothing. I watched her pick up the lipstick and outline a bow upon her hard mouth. "I never saw her," she said, holding the glass away to see the effect, "but I believe she was very lovely. Exquisitely turned out and brilliant in every way. They used to give tremendous parties at Manderley. It was all very sudden and tragic, and I believe he adored her. I need the darker shade of powder with this brilliant red, my dear. Fetch it, will you, and put the box back in the drawer?" And then we were busy then with powder, scent, and rouge until the bell rang and her visitors came in. I handed them their drinks and duly, saying little. I changed the records of the gramophone. I threw away the stubs of cigarettes. "Been doing any sketching lately, little lady?" The forced tearness of an old banker, his monocle dangling on a string, and my bright smile of uncertainty. "No, not very lately. Will you have another cigarette?" It was not that I had answered. I was not there at all. I was following a phantom in my mind whose shadowy form had taken shape at last. Her features were blurred, her coloring indistinct. The setting of her eyes and the texture of her hair were still uncertain, still to be revealed. She had a beauty that endured, and a smile that was not forgotten. Somewhere her voice still lingered, and the memory of her words. There were places she had visited and things that she had touched. Perhaps in cupboards there were clothes that she had worn with the scent still about them. In my bedroom, under my pillow, I had a book that she had taken in her hands, and I could see her turning that first white page, smiling as she wrote, shaking the bent nib. "Max, from Rebecca." Must have been his birthday, and she had put it amongst her other presents on the breakfast table. And they had laughed together as he tore off the paper and the string. She leant, perhaps over his shoulder, while he read, "Max." She called him Max. It was familiar, gay, and easy on the tongue. The family could call him Maxim if they liked, grandmothers and aunts, and people like myself, quiet and dull and youthful, who did not matter. Max was her choice. The word was her possession. She had written it with so great a confidence on the flyleaf of that book. That bold, slanting hand, stabbing the white paper, the symbol of herself, so certain, so assured. How many times she must have written to him thus, in how many varied moods. Little notes, scrawled on half sheets of papers and letters when he was angry, page after page, intimate there news. Her voice echoing through the house and down the garden, careless of familiar like the writing in the book. And I had to call him Maxim. There we go. 2 very long, fantastic chapters. We know his first name. Yay! So here's the book. Thank you so much for joining me this hour. I will see you next time where we will start on chapter 6 and we will see where we go from there. I hope you have a fantastic day. Be safe out there and I will see you next time.